Okay, I think that looks quite stable now. Welcome everyone. My name's Anne Single. I'm the CEO of Patient Voice Initiative. Today I'm here in place of our president, Jessica Bean, who many of you will know as a cystic fibrosis patient and advocate, and her work in Patient Voice Initiative. You may see Jessica lingering in the background watching today's events, but we've given her the morning off from duties. I'm standing here on unceded Yagara and Turrbal lands, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any other First Nations elders who might be joining us today. So today is our second session in this series on patient-based evidence. And patient-based evidence was this term that was developed by Sophie Werkӧ, a researcher based with the Swedish HTA body, and Sophie Staniszewska, who's worked at Oxford University and Warwick University for years, thinking about the nature of patient knowledge and how we can look into the needs, preferences, experiences, and perspectives of patients in a robust way and bring that forward in research. And so we know that we talk an awful lot about patient participation in processes. And so how can you take part and what sort of knowledge you can bring? But one of the things we've been aware of is building the evidence, building the research side of things has not taken off perhaps with the same speed and investment and participation, and yet we think it's equally important. So if you want to know more about patient-based evidence and its origins, you can go back now and watch last week's YouTube, and all the sessions there are available on the Patient Voice Initiative YouTube station. But we wanted to partner with CaPPRe on this research so that we could raise awareness of this side of hearing the patient voice in health policy. And so we've got another jam-packed session for you today. And I'm going to hand over to Cathy Sertori, who's been coordinating these webinars for her, and let her run through what we'll publish this on our YouTube channel. But if there is a this session today, there's only patient organisations and speakers in the room. You can put a note in the chat or you can email us directly and we will cut that from the discussion before it's published. But please make sure you receive confirmation from us that we got your note to say cut that, because we don't want to miss a note like that. So it is being recorded, but if during the question and answer sessions you're speaking and you think, I actually don't want that recorded and put on YouTube, let us know and we'll edit that bit out. And with that, I'll hand over to Cathy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne. And again, welcome back to part two. And for those of you that weren't here last week, Cathy Sertori, extensive 25 plus years in the pharma industry, now out on my own, supporting patient organisations and ensuring the patient voice is heard, and a proud advisory committee member with Patient Voice Initiative. So today, as Anne mentioned, we have got a jam-packed agenda. So we're going to hear from Jo Watson, and we're so grateful for her time in this chaotic, busy time of HTA review and amongst other things. Then we're going to hear from CaPPRe and Hayley around patient-reported outcome measures and patient-reported experience measures, so PROMS and PREMS. Then we will have a break at 12 o'clock for about 10 minutes. And then Maya's going to talk to us from CaPPRe around service evaluation, and Hayley's going to give us her commentary around that as well. And then Anne and I will conclude on some conversations around ethical considerations and seeking funding for patient-based evidence. So as you can see, we have got a lot to get through, but we really want it to be interactive. So please reach out with any questions. We've got the chats happening and enabled, and at any stage, make it interactive, because we've allowed plenty of time for that. And before I introduce and hand to Jo, I would like to put up a poll, if I may. We're going to try and get a bit of a feeling as to what is happening from what are the biggest barriers that your organisation faces in collecting and sharing patient-based evidence. So this one, sadly, you've only got one single choice, so you have to go with the option that is most challenging for you. So if you can please do the poll, if that is there in front of you, that would be fantastic. And I'll wait to see if Cecily gets enough answers and can perhaps share those with us. And while you are finishing your poll, I'll take the opportunity to officially introduce Jo Watson. So Jo is the inaugural Deputy Chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, or PBAC, where she's been a consumer nominee since 2013. She's involved in a wide range of health committees, including as chair of the HDA Consumer Consultative Committee and the Consumers Health Forum, where she's served as deputy chair for 10 years. And Jo has been a community representative and patient advocate in the HIV response since the early 90s, including 16 years as the executive director of the National Association of People Living with HIV Australia in NAPWHA. We are so delighted to have Jo and her experience and expertise here. And as she is getting her slides up, we can see the poll results. So lack of funding resources is a big whopping 75%. So we will take a note of that, and then hopefully that can be part of our discussion at the end of the day. So thank you for participating in that. And without further ado, I will hand over to Jo, and thank you again, Jo.
Thanks, Cathy, and good morning, everyone. And again, thanks to Patient Voice Initiative for the invitation. I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm standing here today in NAPWHA country. I'm down in the Canberra offices, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I was asked to give a bit of a discussion and presentation about patient evidence as we think about it in the context of Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee considerations. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview because I wanted to just step back and think about how it is that we are trying to integrate evidence of any nature coming in from patients, from organisations, from clinicians and others, into for us by way of the submission provided to us by the sponsor. So I think it's the sponsor submission that is a really important thing to try and put into this context. The sponsor submission is, as many of you are aware, a huge amount of data, documentation and materials, and the formal guidelines that are targeting the sponsors that dictate what the sponsor submissions consist of and how they're meant to be put together and what they're required to provide for the purposes of evaluation, technical evaluations and then committee deliberations are pretty onerous. They're a focus on quite, as I said, formal assessment methodology. There are sections that address consumer evidence as part of that. The sponsor submissions are guided, if you like, as to the nature of consumer or patient evidence that can be gleaned from the data sets that sponsors will have as part of the components of the clinical research they've carried out and their research activity as they have developed their drug or their device for the purposes of them bringing to market. As I'm sort of pointing out here in this slide, the the guidance for sponsor submissions is something that touches on both process and deliberation, but not in a great deal of detail, especially, I think, in terms of the way many of us think about consumer evidence and the multiplicity of ways that that could be provided in more depth. That process guidance, both for PBAC and for MSAC, includes information on how consumer input could be obtained. It can also include information about how the department and the committee processes internally also seek to publish agendas and invite submissions from clinicians and patient organisations and others to come in separately through the process. There have been changes over the years, as many of you are aware, both in the way the guidelines have been reviewed for PBAC further back and more recently MSAC, but there's been no real substantial changes in many years now in terms of thinking through what it is that could sit alongside these formal guidance documents for the purposes of sponsors. As we know, in more recent times, we've had the HTA review, we've had the considerations of the co-design enhanced consumer engagement project, and we've had a range of submissions and consultations that have said very clearly that process guidance for the purpose of building a more formal appreciation of consumer evidence and how that can be integrated in a very visible and transparent way into the process, is sorely needed. And I think one of the heartening things from my perspective is that the resourcing that is so sorely needed for both external stakeholder groups such as yours, as well as the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit internally, is really something that I think the recommendations out of both the review and the co-design project have highlighted. I think the other point that's been underlined again in recent review discussions and consultations is that the way that the committees deliberate and the way that aspects of value or values for patient organisations and their patient membership base are considered is not necessarily well understood nor indeed made visible. The notion of transparency or visibility around a whole range of HTA assessment processes has been sorely debated. I think there's value in those debates continuing, because I think rather than one side bearing the onus of responsibility or burden on this, I think all parties need to come together in a sort of sensible way in terms of how it is we can improve the situation where patient groups are being denied visibility over the submissions that are being made for the purposes of HTA consideration. Because a talk like this and others that follow from Simon and what you've already seen in these webinars really underscores the point that the value of evidence and the way it can be integrated into assessments only makes sense if people understand what the technical assessment and evaluation processes are looking at by way of a submission. In other words, by way of what the sponsor is seeking for a potential MBS or PBS listing. So the coming back to how the committee deliberates, if you want to take it from my perspective, I think there's been a number of years now where we've tried to talk about how the diversity of submissions and the context by which they come to us really then determine what it is that the committees are going to be deliberating upon in terms of particular aspects. There's no I think is really how the committee then tries to weigh up what it's obligated to do in terms of looking at comparable clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, but then also other aspects in its decision-making considerations. And I think the consumer inputs by way of information, by way of personal story, by way of case studies, and finally by way of more formal evidence is all part of those other considerations. So critically reflective, I think we have tried to show in different forums that decision-making factors can involve a range of other considerations, and really try and interrogate the submissions before us by looking at what others want to say to us about their preferences, their views, their perceptions of why something is valued or not as a potentially new listing on the PBS. I think the ways that it comes together now is at that ad hoc or informal way, and I think everyone, especially those here today, would be very supportive of seeing if we can get to that next step, as Anne alluded to. Patient-level data that comes in from clinical studies that is in the data sets that are provided by sponsors as a matter of their submission build have a range of challenges or issues. I've just tried to list here quickly what some of these are, and I think that sort of sets the sort of platform, if you like, about why then we want to get clinical input and patient-level input that's going to help address some of these omissions or deficits, if you like, with what can be gleaned from clinical studies, research data sets that are often generated overseas, may not have been specifically built around the notion that it would end up being a data set that would be then evaluated in a country such as Australia for consideration of a listing in an Australian population with a very different health system and the like. So what are we trying to do in terms of the framework then on what makes sense for an evidence build guidance? I think as you've seen through the Conversation for Change work coming out of the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit, as you've seen in the co-design reports and in the HTA review, there's a framework that has slowly started to shape around a notion of what is it that is beyond, again, the technical and more formal clinical and cost-effectiveness comparative frameworks that are required under the legislation. And these frameworks are there to guide sponsors, they're there to help inform our stakeholders as to things that we can try and look at in more formal ways, and also think about where indeed we want to look at them by way of the timelines of the overall process. Everyone's aware of a 17-week cycle that the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee has for PBS considerations. I think there's been many discussions now held about when best makes sense to see a lot of this work come and start at much earlier points rather than at the end towards the committee deliberations. I think this is really a snapshot slide. I've just tried to capture here how I think consumer evidence is integrated currently, and this could be consumer evidence that comes off from the sponsor itself through CaPPRe in its own submissions, or through our external stakeholders such as your organisations or others. I think the consumer evidence is, as part of the committee's considerations, woven into these different aspects. And as I've tried to suggest, depending on the state of the submission and the ask in front of the committee, there's going to be different ways and different emphasis on particular parts of the integration and what it is that's really most meaningful or important for the purpose of that submission in that time period. I just wanted to touch on for a couple of slides what I think are some of the challenges. And that's really unfortunate when we're trying to embark on a process with everyone about how it is that we can give better guidance to what has been of use or not in the considerations and how we can improve that. I think there's limitations by way of just content, but I think there's also limitations in terms of true understanding and interaction about the different ways that things could be considered. I think also that it's been true to say that there's been lots of efforts at different points where either sponsors themselves or consumer groups or clinical groups have tried to put together more significant or substantial documents of work, trying to provide a more comprehensive outline of patient population and needs and issues before them. I think one of the frustrating things for me in all of this is that with the best of intentions, a whole range of resources and time and a whole range of missed opportunities have occurred because we have not had a better way of setting out a template and also being able to talk in real time about what are the issues outstanding versus what is already accepted or what is not in contention. And that to me is one of the biggest motivators for why we should be trying to capture better guidance for both the sponsor applicants as well as those most relevant. I think the ways that we've thought about it over the last several years have been either to change the guideline documents themselves. That's not been proven to be a very satisfactory discussion, shall I say. There's a lot of sense of ownership, again, back to the technical nature and also the legal nature of these things. So several years ago, Sally Wortley and I did try and progress a notion that we could have standalone documents that could sit beside those guideline documents and help them present information about the sorts of things that would make sense for people to engage with if they wanted to go down this path. So, excuse me, I'm just going to try and sum up where I think in terms of patient evidence, what makes sense for the processes we have before us currently around the HTA. I'd also make the point that it's a movable feast, as you're all aware, in terms of what changes or disruptions there may be to the current processes over the next several years. But nevertheless, I think if we worked on some of these aspects, they're going to stand true and solid regardless of some of the other changes that might happen around it. So I think it's a given. I think it's always been pointed out that people now accept the value of patient evidence and inputs that can be put into these HTA processes. The challenge then is to say what was meaningful or of value in doing that, and how is it that we can provide feedback to improve or modify into the future. So this is my snapshot of where I think in the HTA context, we should focus in terms of trying to do the evidence build, and also an evidence build that is absolutely able to be integrated into the submissions before it. I think defining the question around the population that is going to have access to the new treatment is critical. And it beggars belief today that we are still having discussions with groups about who it is that the population should have access to the new treatment, because they're in the dark about who the sponsor has asked for to have access to that new treatment. I think the Australian experience from both clinical management perspectives and the patient experience, again, is another fundamental. a whole range of data sets pulled together from European or American experiences is going to be a challenge for Australian reviewers, not just in terms of an assessment of value, but also in terms of an assessment of how things are going to be implemented and applicable to an Australian health system. I think the benefits or harms of treatment and how that influences patient quality of life is another fundamental. And I say that because I've been privileged to be able to see rooms turn on the basis of Australian patients choosing themselves what they believe is the more significant harm or the more significant benefit, as opposed to what's being presented in the data that comes out of clinical trials. The trade-off between safety and effectiveness is a similar thing. Patients continue to show quite different responses to how clinicians, even their own personal clinicians, would say should be the trade-off in those situations. And I think in determining the outcomes that are important to patients and being able to show that quite formally does not only challenge expert views, but as I said, also can move them. And I think the importance of being able to clarify the expectations of treatment benefits and harms is something that has really focused the minds of committees when they've sat there and realised that the ask is not an ask because people are being naive about the potential promise. It's clarifying that, in fact, patients are very aware of what would still be limitations on the effectiveness or the delivery from these new agents, but nevertheless want them for a range of other reasons that they can eloquently articulate. These next few points, I think, pretty much speak for themselves. I'm not going to labour the point. I think the whole purpose of me setting it out like this, though, is to try and capture it in a way that says to anyone who suggests otherwise that there are formal ways that we can integrate this across the technical areas that are the focus of both the clinical effectiveness review as well as an assessment under a health economics consideration, ultimately to provide the committee with enough data that helps them make the call on cost effectiveness. And then finally, I think it's really important that, again, back to the visibility and transparency we need on the submissions put before us, that patients have an opportunity to see that there are evidence gaps in the data supporting a submission often, not just because there's not a lot of effort being made to find the evidence, but also because in things coming faster to market, faster to committees such as ours, there's going to be limited amounts of time that have been applied to the evidence build for a new agent, a new medicine, a new therapy, and the like. And on that basis, the evidence gaps should be known to clinicians and patients, I would argue, as a way of emphasising what it is that the committees are wrestling with in terms of saying they can confirm or not the value of something. I think the areas of high unmet need is absolutely the privy of a patient population in saying themselves where they perceive to be the priorities and how they see the realities for their populations who are struggling to access particular medicines and are impacted by the new technologies coming through in ways that are not always obvious for them in terms of commercial decisions. Finally, I think the information on values that matter to consumers and or other groups are really important for committees to understand as they deal with the real world in terms of how things will then flow out from their decision making into eventual implementation through a health system and uptake around the community setting. So that's a sort of a bit of a race through, and I hope that's been helpful for today's conversations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jo, and that was incredibly insightful. And it was also interesting, I noticed how, I think it was May this year, that MSAC is sort of looking at the similar process and as PBAC, which I think, you know, people are getting more awareness and understanding of. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just call them out if that's okay, Jo. One from Penelope, and she said, Jo, I take several medications that are on the PBS for other patient groups, but not for me. This applies to most people with conditions that have been internationally underfunded in research. For example, one drug on the PBS only for children under 16 years, one for the PBS for cardiac conditions, but not mine. The MRFF does not seem interested in funding clinical trials to expand the evidence for the range of patients who benefit from well-accepted medications. Do we need to get this issue on the MRFF priority list, or is there a different approach to PBS acceptance for medications that are already on the PBS for other patients?
Wow, well, Penelope, if I wasn't awake before, I am now, I tell you. So I'm going to try and jump down a couple of things there. So you're absolutely right. More and more off-label use is common now across a whole range of diseases and conditions because of a range of these listing barriers or challenges. So I'm just going to mention a few of what I think they are. I'll start with the MRFF. I think the MRFF has a range of streams. It has a really, no surprise to anyone in this room, a really high level of interest from a range of different research aspects and investigators. I'm not sure that the HTA stream of the MRFF lends itself often to individual drugs and those considerations. So I think that's a challenge. I think in terms of the off-label use and what are some of the other barriers more broadly, I think we've got the obvious sort of stick there from the regulator in terms of how the TGA will register something and is very precise in its language about registration for the purpose of a drug entering Australia. Many of you know well that once a drug is registered in Australia and a sponsor puts through its submission to PBS, the PBAC is not meant to go outside of the registration language and the indication as it's written. Now, there have been times when we've tried to find loopholes with that. I'll be really upfront with you all about that. For instance, we may stay silent on something rather than put in the last sentence that TGA has on a registration, just to see if we can show some more flexibility for considerations of clinicians and their patients. Sometimes we've stayed silent, for instance, on age, whereas TGA has been quite specific on age. But there's limitations to how we can sort of thread that needle depending on the specifics. Not a satisfactory answer for those who don't end up being part of that thread that goes through that needle. I think the other thing to say is we are, and I think it was mentioned in the HTA review recommendations, we are still continuing to try and engage through sort of legal advice and discussions internally across the department about other ways we can show more flexibility for what I'd like to call an off-label pathway. I think that's still needed. Repurposing didn't give it to us. Repurposing was well short of where things could have gone, and that's a source of ongoing frustration for me.
Thank you, Jo. I think that's been a really comprehensive answer to a very tricky and challenging question of navigating PBAC, PBS and TGA and all the requirements that go along with that. Another last question from Chris, and I'll open it up to the floor, is should the sponsor submitting the application be engaging with patients and also designing trials that capture what is important to patients? And this is from Chris, Childhood Dementia Initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, you know, we talk about co-design and we talk about partnerships across research as well as regulatory and HTA processes. And the partnership just does not seem to be there in so many of the ways that trial designs are put together. Now, to be fair to industry in this country, a lot of those trial designs, as I've implied in my talk, have actually been done overseas and in other settings. But nevertheless, I think coming into Australia, a commercial sponsor could surely sit down with a patient group and talk through what their commercial objectives are and what they'd like to try and do in Australia to see if something could be tailored or made more fit for purpose for the considerations of the regulator and the HTA processes in this country, you know, in the context of Australian patients and our system.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jo. And I might just pause for a couple of minutes to see if there was anyone else from the audience that wishes to ask a question of Jo, but I found that incredibly useful, and we so appreciate your time, Jo, with your full agenda, and I know all the organisations here today as well do so.
No worries, thank you. And if you don't mind, I might hang around for another half hour.
Sounds fantastic. We'd love to have you. And so there might be some more chat in the chat, Jo, so just keep an eye out. So
Sure.
Without further ado, I will head to our next session, which is Dr. Simon Fifer and Hayley Beer talking about PREMS and PROMS. So Simon, again, for those of you not present last week, is the Director of Research and Innovation at Community and Patient Preference Research CaPPRe, and on the advisory committee at the Patient Voice Initiative PBI. He specialises in studying human decision-making using choice-based measurement techniques with a particular focus on understanding patient preferences in healthcare settings. Simon is the editorial board for the journal The Patient, and also co-chairs the Patient Preference Project Subcommittee, and as part of the HCI's Patient and Citizen Involvement Group. And there is more to Simon that continues on, so he's well versed to talk to us on this subject. And I'll also, because Simon will hand to Hayley, just mention that Hayley is the lead stakeholder engagement and advocacy at Myeloma Australia, and she's also a myeloma clinical nurse consultant at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. Her clinical work includes patient and family preparation for complex therapies, assessment and management of disease and treatment-related side effects, and survivorship care. Hayley also has a passion for research and is currently undertaking a master's in graduate research at Melbourne University. So both of these people are very well versed and qualified to talk to us. So I will now hand to you, Simon, and thank you.
Thanks, Cathy, and thanks, Jo, for that great talk before. Lots of interesting points that we can follow up on, but I'm going to touch on patient-reported outcomes, and I'm going to go through it not too quickly, but quick enough that we can obviously give time to Hayley, because I do want to allow Hayley to speak, because there's important stuff that she's going to go through. I probably won't have time to talk on PREMS today, but we'll come back to that at a later point. And for those who missed it, I did discuss patient preferences in our last webinar last week, and you can see the video that'll be up shortly. So what are patient-reported outcomes? With all the PROMS with the M, we'll talk about in a moment, but they are pretty much what they say. So the PRO, patient-reported outcomes, is a report on the status of a health condition of a patient, from the patient, from their perspective about what's happening with their disease or their treatment. And it may not be captured in other parts of the clinical evidence. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So that's where you have the PRO component. The M comes on the end, so you may see it written as PROMS, is the measurement part. And that's what we're going to talk about today, particularly how do we measure patient-reported outcomes? And that's generally through a question, a survey, some parts that you may have participated in or seen or been involved with before that we then use for information to find out what's going on for that patient, what's happening in their life for these particular outcomes. And we'll talk about that in more detail. This is a slide for your reference. I'm not going to go through how do we validate PROMS. We are going to focus more on PROMS that have been validated. There is a long and rigorous process that goes into all of the different validity tests as to what's gone through before a PROM is generally used for the particular condition. And you can see there it's reliability, validity, all the different types of validity, and then other things like responsiveness, practicality, interpretability, to try and make sure that it's accurate and comparable. And what is it measuring? Is it measuring what we intend it to measure? And how well does it work to do that? So if you look up any PROM, you'll see there's sections on this, but I'm not going to focus on it today. But just keep that in mind when you're going through, looking at the background of some of the measures that you may use. These will be parts that are important to understand. Should I be using this PROM? When was it validated? What are people saying about it when they're using it? There are two main types of PROMs that I'm going to focus on, and that you'll see basically they're split into these broad categories. So generic PROMs, which are comparable across conditions. So you probably experience some of these things like the EQ5D quality of life, SF36 quality of life measures. They're generic. They're covering off general aspects of someone's quality of life that are comparable across conditions, so not specific to that condition. And they're used for a particular purpose in HTA, and we will get to that in a moment. But that's why, so we call those generic PROMs. Disease-specific PROMs directly relate to things of that condition. They may cross over with some of the generic things. They may have some of those questions that cross over between these two, but they are more specific to a condition. So it might be a cancer-specific PROM. It might be a mental health-specific PROM. But there are things that are targeting relevant aspects for that person living with that condition in a disease-specific PROM. So there are differences. And just keep that in mind when we're talking about what might be more relevant if you're thinking about trying to address certain research questions in your organization or partnering to generate evidence. What might be more relevant? Am I going to go a generic PROM or disease-specific? And I'll talk about using them both as well in a moment. In a PROM framework, this is the general stylized version of what we're doing. We have a concept, we have domains that feed into that, and then we have items that feed into those domains. So what do I mean by those three things? The concept is, what are we measuring? Is it quality of life? I just talked about that as a generic PROM before. Is it a psychological state? That's what are we trying to measure. Then there's these domains or subcategories that feed into that core concept. For example, if it was psychological state, it might be depression as one of those domains. An item feeds under that into a domain, and it's generally, what are we actually trying to measure? What the question we're asking. So for example, are you feeling depressed? And it might be on some particular scale over a point in time. So an item feeds into a domain, and the domains then feed into this overall concept of what we're trying to measure. That will become more apparent as we look at a few examples, or if you think back to some of the things that you may have done in terms of participating in this or generating this type of data, think about how it might have been divided up into what are we measuring? What are these categories underneath that? And what are these items or questions that we're asking people that feed into that? So how can we use PROMs? What are the common types of studies in terms of where do they add value? So one general one is a snapshot. So that's just at a point in time. So we might be trying to look at what's the burden of disease? What's it like for people living with this condition happening at this point in time? Or treatment burden. So it could be looking at, well, what happens when they start a treatment? I want to measure something. Could be quality of life, other outcomes that are associated with that. But that's sort of like at one point in time, let's just take a snapshot of what's happening in these people's lives. Taking that a step further into the middle part, we can then look at comparisons. So think about trying to measure outcomes, and then maybe outcomes for people on one treatment versus another, and how that might give you valuable information in terms of how people are tracking on that treatment or how it's actually impacting their lives in terms of these key outcomes. What about over time? What about taking a measurement before I start a treatment or an intervention and then looking how that tracks over time in terms of, is that treatment or intervention working for people in improving the outcomes that may be important to them? So one's a snapshot, one's comparing treatments, looking at that over time as well. That could be both, comparing treatments and over time. And sometimes we may just have it in some of our other research as a control variable. We might just want to say, so for example, in a lot of our preference studies, we have a quality of life measure that's included because we want to see when people are answering about their own preferences, where are they coming from? Who are the people? What are they experiencing at this point in time? And that gives context to their answers. And that's important. So it may not be the key outcome of your study, but it may be something that you have in there anyway. And you still need to choose a PROM. So there may be some where the PROM is the specific key outcome, or it might just be used as put into your study as a secondary outcome that you may use for other types of analysis. So it doesn't have to be primary, but you may have it in there anyway. Bringing people together, we can get this on aggregate. So if you have a group of people it's very important to then look at, well, how is this tracking for people with this particular condition? What's happening in their lives on an aggregate level, or even segments of people. When we looked at segments of people, it's very important. Maybe people living in metro areas versus regional areas, looking at different outcomes for those types of people. So often used in collecting data, and you may have used it in some of your other work in terms of what's happening for the people the communities that you represent as patient organizations. You can actually then take it to a more granular level for an individual. And you can probably see the difference is once I'm talking about a group of people and trying to report on that versus what's happening for a particular individual that may help guide them in their own healthcare journey. And so people who are using this type of data are doing both of those things. Aggregate to look at what could we do for this group of people living with the condition, but for an individual, what about shared decision making? What about what's happening in their life? Where do they need help if I'm tracking their outcomes, their quality of life? What would we focus on for them? So think about that could be an individual in sort of a healthcare journey or a shared decision-making approach versus some of the other types of evidence on aggregate or research objectives that we may use PROMS for. PROMS in HTA. So a lot of what Joe was talking about in terms of consumer evidence, patient evidence coming in, a lot of it is part of it is quality of life and other aspects. Now, this is just an example of a particular type of measurement used in HTA. This is not by any means solely what PROMS are used for in HTA, but just to give you a bit of an example about one component of how they use it. They do look at things like qualities. So quality adjusted life years. You may have seen that in some of those PSDs, those summary documents that Joe mentioned, or in some of the work where you've partnered to generate some of this evidence. A quality takes into account quantity of life gained due to a treatment or an intervention and the quality of that life, and it combines them. So it's a measurement where it combines two things, quantity and quality, and into single metric. And I've given you an example, but I won't focus on that, and we can talk about that more later. But it is a key metric that is used in HTA, where they're actually looking at, is this treatment cost effective? Does it work for a certain cost? And that's part of where we may use PROMS. It's not the only one. I've talked about lots of other objectives that we use. And as you got to go through this presentation, thinking about how much we might use PROMS or different outcomes or quality of life or other things that we may look for different objectives. But this is just an example. So you sort of think, where would this be used in a HTA perspective? Sometimes I may be partnering with people to do that or generating it ourselves, and just keep this terminology in mind as you go through quality of life, quantity of life, and PROMS is a measure that we use for quality of life. And particularly that EQ5D, that generic PROM, is one of those ones that feeds into this. So main considerations from a PROM in terms of what does it include. So when you're looking at different types of measurement, you're going to look at things like an instrument. So what's the questions I'm asking people? And then another part in the middle, and I'll show you some examples in a moment, how do we score that? So it's not just asking the questions, they do need to be scored. Most of the time, that's pretty simple. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about one where it is a little bit more complicated, but most of the time it's pretty much saying, how did they answer, summing those things up, maybe in domains, and then aggregating them up to a top level sum. That's the very simplistic version of it. And then when we do sum those things up, how do we interpret it? That's a very important part as well. What does it mean? If you're getting a score is meaningless unless you know how to interpret it. So that's a very important part. An example is this, one of the examples of the DLQI, so a life quality index for dermatology. You can see that's the questionnaire. So similar things to probably what you participated or generated before. Different outcomes, asking about on questions with different levels. So for example, very much or not at all might be hard to see on your screen, but it's asking those types of questions. So what are you experiencing on those outcomes? You then score it. You can see on the left there, this is how you would score it. So very much is equal to 3, a lot is equal to 2, and then you sum those up and you get a score on the right-hand side, which shows your interpretation. That's one of those really simple ones that I talked about, or relatively simple ones where you take what those 10 questions you asked, give them a number in terms of how people responded, sum them up, and then you can look at, well, how is that actually performing for people's quality of life in dermatology? The EQ5D I mentioned as a generic PROM. You may have seen this as well. 5 domains, sometimes 3 responses, sometimes 5. I'm showing you the version with 5 levels at the moment. And you basically just give an answer on those 5 domains and this visual analog scale to the left. And then we can calculate your quality of life from a generic PROM between essentially 0 and 1, or 0 and 100. The scoring for this is a little bit harder than some of the other ones. There are some papers that talk about how do we actually score these types of generic PROMs, and what are the weights that we use to do that. I've put some references there, but more than happy to answer questions about how you might actually do that in practice. But once you get the actual how people fill it out is very easy. Scoring's a little bit harder, but once you do that and you've done it once, it will be easy to replicate that particular exercise. So how to choose a PROM. So I've talked about generic, disease-specific PROMs, and there's lots within each of those categories. So the key thing is to look at how will it be used? Who is the intended audience? Is it for HTA? Is it for something else? Is it a crossover? Are you going to use it for a HTA submission plus some of your own research objectives? So then once you answer that top question, that'll give you guidance about, well, what do I need here? Do I need a generic PROM? Do I need something that does actually have utility scores that might be relevant for a HTA body? Or do I need a disease-specific PROM? So once again, going back to why you would use one or the other, generic, you want to compare. You might want to use it in HTA to get these utility scores to feed into a quali if that's needed. But it is blunt. So it may not pick up things that are relevant for the people that you represent in the community. But it does have a purpose. So you may still want to use it there, but if you want something that also goes into more detailed aspects about a particular condition, maybe you want a disease-specific PROM, which has obviously been validated for people living with that condition and covers those relevant aspects that may be missing in a generic PROM. You don't have to do either or. You can do both. So just think about it. Maybe I do need both. In terms of covering it off. Just think about obviously the time when you're asking people to do this, how much time it's going to take them, but you don't always have to trade off and go, well, I'll just have to use a generic PROM. Maybe you want to do it both so you get the best of both worlds. So just keep that in mind. Other things to consider, is it free? So researchers have generated and validated these things. Sometimes it's not free. For patients who are doing their research and organizations, generally it is, which is great. So just have a look at that when you're choosing a PROM and say, I'm a patient researcher, I'm from an organization, is this free for me to use? Because I don't want to be paying $10,000 to access a particular measure. How easy is it for people to understand? That's been tested, but you will probably want to do your own testing as well. And Hayley will talk about a lot of that in a moment, testing for myeloma. Easy to administer. Does it work well online or mobiles when people are generally doing it? Validation I talked about, and then cultural and language considerations as well, which are relevant. So where would you find the PROMs? Here's an example from one of the Australian Commission on Safety, Quality and Healthcare. Really good resource. I put the link there. A really good resource about splitting generic PROMs and disease-specific. They have a really good catalog, and you can easily search and then click on them, and they bring up all the information about that particular measure. So this generic link. Here is the disease-specific link in terms of all of the different PROMs that they have. They don't cover all of them, but they do cover a lot of them. And so that's a great resource to look at to start with. Another one is a global group called ICHOM, who also have a really big database and list of PROMs in terms of lots of research that's been done or what people are currently using in that disease area, what goes into clinical trials, all of those things are covered. So that's another really good resource if you want to see, well, what could I use? What does it cover and what might be relevant for objectives that I'm focusing on for my organization and my community? So that's really, I have some references there as well. That's really all I had in terms of going through PROMs. As I said before, I won't have time to cover PREMS, unfortunately, but we can talk about patient experience measures at a later point and certainly can answer questions. But I did want to give Hayley enough time to go through her research. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, and welcome, Hayley. That was really insightful and debunking all the mystique behind PREMS and how they're delivered. And we're looking forward to Hayley bringing this to life for us. So over to you, Hayley, when you are ready.
Thanks, Cathy, and thanks, Simon. I always learn so much from you, and I wish I had you in my pocket when I'm wandering around trying to learn how to do research. But thank you to CaPPRe and PBI for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about my experience of using PROMS or trying to learn how to use them better through this study that we did. So the initial, or the way this came about for me, was that we noticed in the clinical practice that there was a new combination of therapies that we were using for patients with myeloma. And those that were what we call fit into the transplant ineligible population, which are those that are generally maybe a bit older or have some other health problems and can't withstand a really high dose therapy. The PBS recommended this new regimen for everybody, and we noticed that those that were maybe not so fit were having trouble with this new standard of care therapy. But we wanted to assess their quality of life in the real world, because the studies that were used to approve this combination of drugs on the PBS only had 38% of participants in that age bracket or that group of patients who are perhaps a bit less fit. So we wanted to do a real world quality of life study on the patients to see if what we were observing in the clinic was real. But we didn't know which PROMs to choose. You know, there's lots of PROMs. Simon just mentioned there's many to choose from. And we found that a systematic review of 32 randomized controlled trials in myeloma, that they used quality of life or PROMs in their clinical trials, but they didn't involve the patients in the selection of those PROMs. So we wanted to know which ones did the patients prefer to use and which ones were most adequate in measuring their quality of life. I had some experience as a trial coordinator in clinical trials, and it was a personal bugbear that often in the trials that I was looking after, I would have to give patients a huge stack of PROMs for them to fill out, but I knew that they weren't necessarily directing their care. They were more a tick box exercise to go into a database to inform the outputs of the clinical trial. So that I didn't feel like that was really going to suit my purpose, which was purely to assess quality of life and nothing else. And being a rookie researcher that I am, I found the whole concept of designing this pure quality of life trial really confusing. So ultimately, we decided to go to the patients and find out what it is that they wanted. And the study aim was to establish a suite of validated PROMs for use in real-world clinical trials. So we wanted to recruit patients who had myeloma and who had experience of receiving therapy before, to make sure that they could think about what it's like to have treatment and have side effects. And we used the Myeloma Australia newsletter to recruit our participants, and in order to do semi-structured telephone interviews with the participants. So we recruited really fast. There was a lot of interest in this study. We had 32 people express interest, and within 3 weeks, we had 26 participants who were eligible and could go through with an interview. There was an equal spread of males and females. We also had both metro and regional representation. And they were very experienced patients, having an average of 9 years since their diagnosis and at least an average of 3 lines of treatment previously, and an average age of 67 years. We had good representation across the country too. And we looked through the clinical trials in myeloma and found 10 of them, I guess, commonly used, but quite a lot of variation in the types of PROMs that had been used in trials. So we selected these 10 and to use for the participants to review. So we asked them to review all 10 PROMs and to consider if each of those tools addressed issues or aspects in the quality of life that are important to them. And if there was any questions included in those tools that they didn't think were applicable, and if they thought that that particular PROM should be included in the final collection. We also wanted to know what the maximum number of tools they thought would be acceptable to fill in at any one time, how long they would be acceptable to spend filling in the tools, which collection, if they could choose, would be most suitable. Were there any aspects in those tools that weren't covered that they felt were important? Did they prefer paper or electronic based tools to fill out? And did they think they would need any help to fill them in? So the results, no two experiences with myeloma are the same. So not surprisingly, we had a very wide range of opinions and feedback through the qualitative interviews to go through. But ultimately, we found that they reported each tool was easy to understand, which was great because they were validated tools. So that's part of that validation process. That they wouldn't mind paper or electronic versions, and they might need help depending on where they were in their treatment cycle, bearing in mind that some treatments can have a cognitive effect on memory and concentration. So these two results surprised me, that they felt that they would spend 40 to 60 minutes on filling them in, which I thought 5 minutes would be what would be acceptable, but they felt this was so important to them that they would spend the time, and that they would also complete up to 5 tools if they had to. So this basically just shows that amongst the 10 tools that we got them to review, that they were all fine. I guess ultimately they all did their job. So this didn't really give us much towards finding our final selection of tools. And what was quite lovely that came through in a lot of the interviews was that they were often thinking about others. So as they were reviewing tools, they thought, oh, that I haven't really experienced that, but I know so-and-so who I know has, so I don't want to discount that because I don't want to eliminate that for somebody else. So from the question of should this tool be included, again, they all ranked quite highly, but the only one that 100% of participants felt should be included was the MyPOS, which is a myeloma-specific PROM. So in order to finalise our selection of PROMs, we developed 2 criteria from the data that we collected from the interviews to help us refine which tools to use. So those were that the tool must ensure adequate coverage of all priority quality of life domains. So Simon just spoke about domains within quality of life tools. So there were certain themes that came through from the participants that helped us choose which domains were most important to them, and to minimise the burden of the activity for the patient. These were the domains that came through as being most important to the participants. So physical health, psychological health, practical and functional health, social relationships, spiritual health and resilience, and information and healthcare support. So we wanted to find a collection of those tools that would robustly cover these 6 domains. And this is what we came to in the end. So the MyPOS obviously was the 100% of participants recommended this tool, but it was also commented or reported back that fatigue wasn't covered very well in this tool, and fatigue is one of the most common and life-limiting side effect or symptom of patients living with myeloma, so we thought it was important to measure that well using the brief fatigue inventory. And also the financial toxicity of living with a chronic illness like multiple myeloma is also quite prevalent, and they felt that having an opportunity to report back on financial toxicity was important. So we included the cost facet too. So 3 tools in the end. So the MyPOS starts by asking you to, in an open text box, so that was the only tool that had ability to write freehand, not a tick box question. So they liked that from the get-go, at the top of the questionnaire, it asks you to reflect on the top 3 most important things that are happening to you at that time, which they thought was a really good way to reflect and kind of get them thinking about their quality of life or their symptoms. And they felt it made it more interactive too. So the participants really valued the opportunity to express what matters most to them and to be able to contribute to this piece of research and reflect on their experience. And somebody also commented that sometimes they feel that their symptoms or side effects are not that important, or they they're not asked about them all the times from maybe their doctor hasn't asked them about something specific, so they haven't felt it's important enough to express, but doing that process of filling out the PROMS gave them validation in what they were feeling, and then it was important to report. And not one measure captured the wide range of concerns for this patient population, so it is important to have a collection rather than just rely on the heavy lifting of one tool. And we are now using that collection of PROMS in our survivorship or living better with myeloma clinic at PBAC where I work. We did publish this study, so if you want to read more about it, it can be found there. I'm happy to share it. And I'd like to say thank you to the participants who were involved in the study and the funders to make it possible. The magnificent Holly Chung, who was the research assistant, and my supervisor, Mai Krishnasamy, who's just a saint. So thank you.
Wow, Hayley, thank you. That was truly insightful. I loved hearing the theory from Simon around the PROMS and seeing you bring that to life. And I think it was really true to the name of PROMS in that it was developed and co-designed with patients, which is so important, and that the patients developed the tools and validated them. And you could really sense that with the results that came through. And it was also probably not surprising that 100% wanted the disease-specific included rather than generic. So I think that really talks to that personalised experience. And seeing those domains brought to life, when Simon was talking about them, I was thinking, what could they be? So actually having you outline them really gave me that sort of true understanding. Before we go to a break, I'll just see if there's any questions that are coming up for Hayley, apart from being a great presentation. Oh, here's one from Claire Stuart for you, Hayley. Hayley, had anyone else outside of Australia analysed the current PROMS for myeloma and concluded about which PROMS were relevant? If not, why do you think no one else outside Australia has done this? If yes, did your study find different results? And then I'll pause there, and then there's a question for Simon.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Thanks, Cathy. No, so we tried to go to literature to see if it would tell us what to do, and there wasn't anything there. So that was another reason to do this piece of work, because it was a stark gap in the literature, and it doesn't seem that. I thought I could go to some supportive care research colleagues that I know in the haematology space, and it really wasn't, there wasn't a direct pathway forward. So it felt that's, the only, the best way forward was to just go to the patients, because ultimately that's what we were trying to do, a real world study.
And to that end, congratulations on the publication. Hopefully that has gone worldwide and viral, because that, to Claire's point, it needs to, and it's Australia leading the way. Simon, a question for you. Do you think that geography context matters for PROMS? Is it worth us focusing on the Australian community's experiences as distinct from people with the same condition living in other countries?
Short answer, yes. Yes, I think it does matter. I think it's in terms of the validation of the PROM, but also in its use, in terms of the responses that you're getting. I think even within the Australian community, I think geography matters, where people are living, what's happening for them. I think you'd get different, I guess, experiences coming through, even and across countries, definitely. I mean, even if you look at one of the ones that Hayley put up, the cost facet, which is looking at financial toxicity. Think about how that could be different from someone living in a regional area, remote, versus a metro area. And think about how it could differ from someone living in a different country to Australia. So definitely geography matters depending on the PROM that you're using. And so it is always good to contextualize and see, does this work for the people that I'm talking to? And I think Hayley's example of how actually talking with people and then checking does it work and then looking what actually relates for them is important in any context. But yes, geography does matter. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for your question, Claire. And that was from Claire from the Mito Foundation. So we're going to pause now for a quick break. If we can maybe have you back just after 15:15 so we can make sure we finish right on time. So grab a cuppa, water, whatever you need, and have a bit of a stretch of the legs, and we'll see you back here 12:16, 17 if I'm being the precise timekeeper. Thank you. And while you are doing the poll, and Maya is ahead of the game and has already set up her slides, I would like to introduce Maya Joshi, who is the patient-centered research lead at Community and Patient Preference Research, CaPPRe, where she's dedicated to advancing high-impact research that captures what is most important to patients when it comes to treatment and care. Maya works closely with patient organisations, members of industry and other stakeholders on patient-related research, and is committed to using preference research to amplify the patient voice and meaningfully integrate patient values into healthcare decision-making at both an individual and systems level. Prior to joining CaPPRe and moving to Australia, you will notice the accent, Maya worked in the health consumer space in Canada, focusing on patient-centred research, patient education and advocacy initiatives in the field of rheumatology. So before I officially hand to you, Maya, do we have any results of the poll to share with the audience, please? Okay, it's a pretty equal split between, well, lack of transparency about other evidence submitted. So that's good. People feel comfortable with that, but fairly evenly split about lack of guidance. So hopefully Jo's presentation helped a bit with that. Lack of communication and difficulty in demonstrating. Well, this is what we hope to help you solve. So we will take a note of that, and Patient Voice Initiative and CaPPRe will, that's really helpful to do that. So without further ado, I will hand over to Maya to take us through service evaluation research.
Thanks so much, Cathy. Yeah, we've got a really fantastic overview of different types of patient-based evidence, both today and last week with part 1 of the webinar. I just wanted to really quickly talk about a different type of research, service evaluation research, as we know that this can be particularly useful for patient advocacy organizations. And having previously worked in patient advocacy in Canada, I've had some experience both on the patient advocacy side of this type of research and as a researcher helping other orgs with this. Okay. So the sort of research can help answer questions like which resources are most valued by the community, so which things are considered to be most important, as well as if there are any potential gaps or if there are any improvements that could be made. Some patient organizations could also be interested in understanding the demographic makeup of the community that you're providing support to, as well as how these different demographic characteristics can influence preferences for different support services. So as Simon just said, context and geography can matter, and we might find that people living in rural or regional conditions are needing different sorts of support compared to those living in metro areas. So this sort of information can be helpful to support funding proposals by showing where more support is needed, as well as informing internal program development and resource allocation within the organization so that we can see what areas should be prioritized, as well as can just be helpful in other advocacy initiatives or campaigns. To use this study that I had the pleasure of conducting alongside Hayley from Myeloma Australia last year as an example of this type of research and to talk about the kind of methods that can be used. So the objectives of this study were to understand the relative importance of different myeloma support services, how satisfied people in the community were with these services provided by Myeloma Australia, what improvements could be made to increase satisfaction, as well as if any additional services or support was needed. And then lastly, as a sort of secondary objective, Myeloma Australia was interested in understanding access to treatment and where the gaps were for that. So we worked really closely with Hayley and some of her other amazing colleagues at Myeloma Australia to develop a survey that was specifically designed to answer those research questions. There were a number of different aspects of the survey so that we could get a comprehensive picture of the community's experiences, including basic demographic questions, treatment experience, and disease history, But the two main things we were really focused on understanding was satisfaction and importance. We had really great success with recruitment, and I think that's a testament to how much people living with myeloma and impacted by myeloma value Myeloma Australia, and that they were really excited and happy to help out in this research. So we had almost 400 individuals, including patients and carers, respond to the survey. Now, as I said, importance and satisfaction were the key things we were interested in understanding. To measure importance, we used this methodology called best-worst scaling, which is something that we often use at CaPPRe for a number of different objectives, but it's particularly relevant for service evaluation. So what happened is we identified the key 7 services provided by Myeloma Australia, including a support line, general information on the website, information on social media, and then online and in-person support groups and webinars and seminars. So over a series of different screens, participants were shown a subset of these services, and then they were asked to select what they felt was the service that was most important to them and what they felt was least important. And by observing how people's answers changed across screens, we could then determine how they were ranking these items. So this method is considered to be stronger and more reliable than a standard scale-based method, like please rate your importance on a scale from 1 to 10. And this is because my 8 out of 10 could be very different from Cathy's 8 out of 10. And additionally, when it comes to support for really serious health conditions, especially things like cancer, everything is really important. And it would be a completely, valid answer to have a participant say that everything was 10 out of 10 importance. But unfortunately, that doesn't provide as much insight or answers into then what should be prioritized and where resources should be allocated. So here's an example of what that looks like. So you can see here that people were asked to answer 7 different scenarios that looked like this one. They were asked, thinking about your personal experiences and preferences related to support services, please select which item is most important and which is least important. So it really forces you to sort of make those trade-offs and think about what matters to you. Now, this method, as I said, can be used for lots of different needs, including patient experience measures, which I know Simon didn't have a chance to talk about today, but hopefully looking at this scenario, you can imagine how this same sort of exercise could be used to understand people's experiences across the whole healthcare pathway. So for example, talking about the importance of communication with healthcare providers, patient support programs, things like that, and trading off what's most important and what you're most and least satisfied with. Now for this project, importance was measured using best-worst scaling, but for satisfaction, we actually used that standard scale-based measure, which I did mention some of the flaws for, but in this scenario, it's what made most sense because we were interested in understanding how everybody in the community felt about importance. But of course, it only makes sense to say how satisfied you are with services you've actually used yourself. So that means that some people would only be rating satisfaction for 1 to 2 things, while others would be rating satisfaction for all 7. So best-worst scaling method wasn't something that worked. But we used it for importance, different standard scaling for satisfaction, and then we put these things together to get a comprehensive understanding of what mattered to people. And in other sections of the survey, we asked more in-depth questions about their experiences, including open text answers. So the survey design led to some really interesting outputs, including this relative importance chart. So this chart shows how participants valued different myeloma support services based on their answers to that best-worst scaling task. We then rescale the scores out of 10 so that they can be compared between individuals. You'll see that the nurse-run telephone support line was most highly valued by the community, followed by general information from Myeloma Australia's website. There were some other interesting things that came out of this chart. So for example, you can see that when it comes to workshops and seminars, people valued an online version of that programming more than in person. But when it came to support groups, the opposite was true. So people preferred in-person support groups to online support groups. So this slide, I've just put together a bit of a summary of some of the satisfaction outputs, which were collected for each of the 7 services. So this is just a summary of the nurse-run support line satisfaction information. This histogram is showing the distribution of satisfaction ratings among participants. You can see the mean satisfaction was 8.9 out of 10, so people were highly satisfied, but then also there was a big proportion of participants who rated their satisfaction at 10 out of 10. We asked people in an open text box to tell us what's the reason for your rating. And then we analyzed these open text answers and coded them into different key themes so we could see what was driving people's experiences. So we found that quality of information and knowledge, as well as nature of the staff, was what was really behind people's high satisfaction ratings. It was actually really lovely going through these open text answers and seeing these really heartfelt messages from the community about what these different programs meant to them. We also gave participants the opportunity to tell us if they had any suggested improvements for these programs. And the 2 key things that stood out were extending hours outside of the workday and providing access to local nurses for region-specific advice over the phone. So as I said, there were some other sections of the survey, and I won't go through all that information today, but just as an example of some of the other things that came out of the research, we found that there were certain topics participants wanted more information on, specifically clinical trials and emerging treatments and currently available treatments in Australia. I thought this was relevant to the conversation today. We asked participants about their familiarity with HTA bodies in Australia, like PBAC and MSAC, which Joe spoke about this morning. We found that people generally had pretty low self-rated familiarity with these services, with these bodies, but they were very interested in learning more about these bodies, which was really interesting to see. So that was all that I really wanted to cover. And now I wanted to invite Hayley back to the discussion to talk about your experience, Hayley, from Myeloma Australia's perspective.
Thanks, Maya. It was an excellent presentation and great to reflect back on that time. It was we learned some great insights from that work together. Yeah. What would you say, Hayley, was some of the value of this sort of research to Myeloma Australia and potentially other patient orgs? Yeah, I think the relevance goes across all patient organisations. It's a really good activity or exercise to do for, learning again, asking your people, what do they want? How are they finding the things that you're providing, and what would they like you to see more of or do differently? It's also really helpful. We all are constantly needing to seek funds and support for the things that we do, and it really helps show your impact on your community, and it's really, really helpful for those things. And also when you're submitting reports or advocating for new therapies, so that section of the questionnaire that related to the PBAC and MSAC was because at the time that we did this exercise, we were also trying to get CAR T-cell therapy funded, or it was up before MSAC, and we were about to launch an advocacy campaign to help support our community to submit consumer comments to that process, and we had never had an experience with MSAC before. We wanted to use that information to inform the advocacy campaign so we could help patients be involved in that process. And I have to say we broke the record for the most consumer comments submitted to MSAC for that application. So it was a very successful exercise.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Hayley.
Wow, I think we'll have to get you back, Hayley, to talk about MSAC, because that was an area that people didn't know much about, and so hold that thought. But thank you both very much for those really clear insights, Maya, as opposed to PREMS and PROMS, that there are other ways that people can do research, and we're learning today, it's certainly not one size fits all. And I think what was interesting too, that while it's really tough to make a trade-off, but it's important because you actually get better results when you're not having everything 10 out of 10 or 1 out of 10. It actually gives, helps with those scales. And before I move on to the next topic, is there anything else that Myra or Hayley that you would like to add, or any questions from the audience? There's been nothing that's come through in the chat, but it was really excellent and really fantastic to bring it to life, and in such a short time frame too. We could probably spend so much more time on this topic. Perfect. Well, thank you. We'll keep an eye out on the chat, and please, everyone, feel free to, if there's things that come to mind around what Myra and Hayley have talked about, please pop that into the chat. 2 more discussion topics before we are going to wrap this up, and we're back on track for time now. And 2 other areas that have come up with patient organisations that they're keen to learn and touch a little bit more on. Firstly is the topic of ethics. So I'm going to hand to Anne to bring up a few things to think about when considering ethical considerations through patient-based research. And then we'll move on to a little couple of tips and tricks for researchers. So Anne, I will hand to you, please.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. And like everything in these sessions, this session's just to give you a little bit of a taste of this area and help you explore where your interests lie. So I wanted to talk just for a few minutes, and I'm putting my timer on, about ethics. And I'm drawing here on the work that was done almost more than a decade ago, by the Health Technology Assessment International's Patient and Citizens Interest Group, because a question came up for us about, okay, so when researchers are doing research maybe with patients or maybe leading it separately, they will take research to an ethics committee. But what should patient groups do when they're collecting and reporting reporting information for HTA submissions? And so we wanted to put together a little bit of guidance, really just about what sort of questions to consider. And I'm going to run through those, but I just want to stop and acknowledge the people who worked with me on that project. Neil Bertelson, Jenni Whale from here in Australia, and Anna Scott, who was in Australia at the time, and the HTAI Ethics Interest Group. So the first question we'd suggest that you think about is, do you really need to do the research? And the reason, we've been sitting here encouraging you to do research, but one of the reasons for that is because you know that you as patient organisations have a range of priorities. So do your patient communities. And when we ask people to participate in research, we're often using their best days or days that they could be doing other things. So we want to make sure that we really need to do it. And if we think back to what Jo Watson was saying earlier today, she was talking about that need for dialogue to find out what the outstanding issues are. So, we don't need to do research that you're not going to actually be able to address a gap in knowledge in. And so having that dialogue with people like the PBAC and Jo Watson about what is missing in the evidence and what do you actually already need to, what do you need to do, or what actually might you already have evidence for within your organisation. The second question to think about in terms of ethical considerations is, how are you going to reach a broad population? Who should be heard here? Who is not being served in the community? Who are you not hearing from? From my perspective, I often try to think of people who are not like me. Who is out there who doesn't come from a similar background to me, who may not look like me, who may also, though, be part of my patient community? And how can I find a way to connect to them? The ethic of it being inclusive. The next question is each person who is asked to take part competent to consent. So you can see in this question, there's a bit of an assumption that you are going to have an informed consent process. And that's really important with any research like this. So people should know that they have the right not to take part. They don't have to feel that because they're a member of your organisation and say passionate about access to new treatments, that they're obliged to take part. Sometimes it's not the right time for them to take part, and we need to be really clear that we understand that. So people also need to know they can stop taking part if they want to. They need to know who's involved with doing the research, who's funding that research, be transparent about that funding. Have we asked them if they might identify as part of a vulnerable group and need additional adjustments or supports? Are they realistic about the benefits that may flow from this research? You know, we might involve patients in research because we're particularly thinking about a treatment being considered by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, and we may see this research as helping to get something listed. But we need to be very clear with people that the research will be one source of evidence in a decision. So it's not a promise of a decision in the favour of something a patient community wants. So we need to just really manage expectations around this work. And we also need to be very thoughtful about potential harm from research. So sometimes in research, when we're asking people to reflect about their experiences, what we're doing is we're asking people to go back to some of those experiences and some of those times that may have been the worst times of their life, and we're asking them to think about them. And that's very challenging, and we need to be very thoughtful about that and think about how we provide support for that sort of experience. Question 4 is, have you ensured that people taking part cannot be identified in the submission? So what are you doing to protect their anonymity? And in some cases, you might actually just have to be clear with people that it's such a small group that people such as you within the patient organisation may be able to determine that. And you may need to just have an upfront discussion about that. So how can you protect their anonymity, and what are the limitations of that? And the final question is there, how will you protect the data and participants' privacy? And this is a really important question for thinking about what sort of protections will you have? How will the data be locked away? It builds on the anonymity question, but it might relate to your organization's data protection policies. And if not, we all live in jurisdictions where there are laws around this. So if you're a very big organization with millions of dollars, the Privacy Act might relate to you. In different states, there's different laws around this. And so I put up there also the ACNC website link because I think they've got really good information there about how you need to manage people's information and data and what are your responsibilities there. So just to wrap up, there's the 5 questions. You can follow the QR link and go to just a 2-page guide on the web, which sets out a few more underlying questions and explains a bit more here. And really the idea of that guide is that you may not actually address all the questions underneath these, but have you thought about that? Have you got in place what you need to have in place to do this work? And there's also a long guide as well. Unfortunately, the link is not available at the moment, but we'll get it onto our website as soon as it is available. I'm happy to take any questions if time permits, Cathy.
Yes, there is definitely time permitting, and if you, while people are thinking about it, you can add it into the chat. But I think it's a really, having heard all the excitement and enthusiasm of what we can do with PREMS and PROMS and service evaluations, it's a really important topic, ethics and those considerations when doing so. So I think it's really valuable to have those resources available as well. I will pull up this and we can get going on our final topic, which is considerations and top tips for funding. And I've only got 5 slides because we, again, as Anne said, these are sort of conversation starters, thought provokers, and that we're very happy to table offline after the session as well. So some of the challenges and barriers to funding, I thought I'd start with the hard things. So it's things like alignment of your organisation to the requester, where you're getting funds from. What are the budget and funding limitations? There might just be a small pool of money or grants that are available. The capability and time to write submissions, because that also detracts from other support services that you are providing to your community. Regulations and compliance issues, and I'll add to that the ethics considerations too. And also the black hole, as things are sort of uncovering information you can't find or are unable to get feedback on. So some of the questions and practical considerations to think about when you're looking to seek to funding: be really clear on the purpose of your organisation's research objectives, and what are those points? Do you actually need to do it? Will it benefit you and your organisation and community? And does it align with your long-term organisation's long-term strategy? Conduct a review on companies that you believe are aligned with your values and strategic goals, because that way you'll feel more comfortable working together or being able to receive grant money from those requestors. Identify funding sources. This could be a range of grants through government sources and bodies. It could be through pharmaceutical companies, and it could be through other grants that I know pop up, corporate social responsibility concepts. And then it's really important to clarify and align with that organisation or wherever you are requesting that money from. What are the company's goals? Is there a mutual alignment? Is the budget actually feasible? What that you're requesting that they would have available for you? And you can even make sure you be very explicit and transparent. Does what we are looking to achieve align with your goals? And don't develop a detailed budget and waste all the time devil in the details until you're comfortable with all of those answers. And in terms of when you're writing the submission, it's really important to have a compelling proposal, being really clear on the aim of your research, the methodology that you'll be using, expected outcomes, and an emotive comment on why that impact would really deserve the funding and support your community. Organisational capacity. So it would be really helpful to show a track record, sort of leadership qualities and any evidence of past achievements that you have done on delivering on research funding. Budget wisely, so a realistic, once you've agreed on the way forward from putting in a submission, a realistic and detailed budget, and make sure it sort of aligns with the funders' expectations as well. And I think an important piece is to emphasise sustainability, so how your project will generate longer term benefits for your organisation and the community. Really important to try and seek feedback from colleagues, mentors or other experts in your field, because that can really give you some sort of fresh eyes and review as well. And really important to follow up with the funders to inquire about the status and research feedback, because you don't want it to end up in that black hole. So some of the areas where you can overcome some of the barriers that we've talked about at the beginning, demonstrating any previous wins and successes, because that will add to your credibility. Finding champions for your cause. So within the Department of Health, government, industry, Medicines Australia, Patient Voice Initiative, CaPPRe, and other organisations, there's a whole number of areas where you can look to get some support and guidance. Broadening networks, consider other funding opportunities, like thinking outside the box. Look at what's happening in other industries, not on the health industry, seeking a mentor in a different organisation, and consider individual donors to champion a specific cause. And some examples which I'll put in the chat are pre-budget submission examples that can also provide some good sort of basis for how other people are tackling funding requests. And finally, don't lose sight of the fact that you are the experts of your community. So you be clear on your goals and what can I affect or you affect as your community versus what's out of your control. Will the patient organisation benefit from the result, from the research? What are unanswered questions that need addressing that you're looking to do? And who are the champions? And are the time frames realistic? And can I meet those requirements? So that's all I wanted to share from a presentation perspective, which was quite quick. And I can have a habit of talking fast, but I was wanting to really make sure we kept to time and finished today. So I would like to hand it out to any of the audience if there are any questions on the ethics, on the research funding tips or challenges that you'd like to share. And otherwise, I'll just pause and check the chat. But at this stage, I don't think there are any questions. So if that's the case, I might, before I hand to Anne to do a wrap, we've got one more final poll. So if I think Cecily behind the scenes is able to put up that poll question. And here is actually one that you can use all of the above. So what is the most critical factor patient organisations should consider when designing patient evidence projects? Ethical issues around patient privacy and data security, clarity about what sort of information is needed for different healthcare policies and recommendations, inclusivity and representation of diverse patient populations, collaboration with healthcare professionals and policymakers, or the last option is all of the above. So please have a think, and this can help input to information that PVI and CaPPRe can consider. Great. Well, we'll just give everyone a moment or two to complete the poll and we'll have a look at the results. And then I will hand to you, Anne, for some closing reflections and thoughts.
Excellent. I'm just watching those poll numbers. I think it's stabilizing. It's always quite a lot to read at once. So okay, so
Wow.
I think it's finished. Do you want to? Oh, you're sharing that? Great. Great. That's really that's helpful. That sort of so thank you very much for taking part in that. I'm just going to finish up now. I'm going to speak a little slower now, so apologies. I was getting a bit pacey there on that last one. So thanks for holding in there. I want to thank a couple of people for today, particularly. I want to thank CaPPRe for partnering with us. CaPPRe has been with Patient Voice Initiative right from the beginning. Laurie Axford is our Vice President. Simon is on our advisory committee, and the whole team have really worked with Patient Voice Initiative for a long time and are currently taking part pro bono doing our benchmarking survey about how patient communities want to interact with the pharmaceutical industry in Australia. So if you want to be a part of that survey, we'd love to hear from you. So do contact us. I want to thank Cecily Powers, who's behind the scenes and always pretty much holding up Patient Voice Initiative while looking after a very newborn baby as well. And so, Cecily, we're so grateful for the way you do your work and for your intelligence and social and emotional intelligence that you bring to your role as well. I want to thank our speakers, Jo Watson, Simon Fifer, of course, Hayley, Joshi, and Cathy Sertori. Thank you so much. As Cathy said, she's now on our advisory committee. We feel so grateful to have her perspective there as well, and really appreciative of the work to pull these sessions together. I want to make sure to acknowledge our really valued sponsors. Every year, Patient Voice Initiative puts together a work program driven and informed sometimes by these polls that we do at these sessions, give us ideas about where is their need, but also from the dialogue with the patient communities. And so we see ourselves as a patient organisation that is very much about a particular area of health policy, looking at that patient voice in health technology assessment and how we can improve that, and how health technology assessment can be really informed by what matters most to our patient communities. And so we go to our sponsors, and currently we have these companies as our gold sponsors. We're incredibly grateful to them, as well as these companies who are our silver sponsors. And finally, I just want to show you a couple of follow-up addresses there. So if you want to find out more about how to be involved in things like giving input or doing research for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, so the group that advises on what should be on the pharmaceutical benefits list, or if you want to be involved in and learn more about the Medical Services Advisory Committee, you can go to our Patient Voice Hub, and there are just short 15-minute topics there to give you an overview of how you can be involved and what your knowledge as from a patient community's perspective can bring to the topic. You can also, there's a 15-minute session there on what is health technology assessment. And there's another one that's all about when something's in the pipeline. You know, maybe some of your members are part of a clinical trial, or maybe you see something starting to come forward for the FDA and you want to know, well, what's going on there? How could we get prepared so that we're not having to do everything and think about what we want to input to this just when we see it on the agenda, published on the Office of HTA Consultation Hub. So do check out that resource. You can also follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. We always carry the PBAC and the MSAC agendas there when they're published, and we give reminders about when consultation is closing. You can check out our resources website. If you email that email address there, contact@patientvoiceinitiative.org, Cecily is very efficient at making sure that it's directed to the right person or answering your query yourself. And of course, if you missed any section of today, or you missed the first session of this webinar, you can check out our YouTube channel, which has all our previous webinars as well. And so with that, I'm going to give us all 5 minutes back to our day. And thank you once again for joining us, and encourage you to reach out to us and contact us with any questions. We're always happy to help. And if we don't know the answers, we're happy to send you in the right direction. Thank you very much.